All right. It seems like the joining of folks has slowed down just a little bit, so I'll go ahead and officially bring us into the session here. Thank you everyone for joining us for our third session of the week for our virtual conversation series for leadership educators. And today we're going to be talking with Denny Roberts about infusing some international leadership and what that looks like for us within that context. Before Denny comes in to take over the presentation here, I just thought I would do some kind of level setting and community standards here for you. So Zoom probably is all too familiar to many of you, but in case it's not, I just thought I would share some how to use the platform posts for you here. So please feel that at any time you can put questions in the chat feature here, or if you want to private message those to me as in the chat as well, and I can share those with Denny or pose those to Denny for you. We'll ask folks to keep your cameras, you can keep your cameras on or off if you want to, but to keep yourself muted to kind of limit some of that background noise. And then we'll keep working through our presentation and keep this to as close to an hour as we can, because we know that you're busy and you've got a lot of things to do in this time. As we're getting started, I do want to offer a LeaderShape's land acknowledgement to you all, and thinking about the spaces where we're joining from, the people who came before us on the lands where we are too. As I shared in the chat, I'm here in central Illinois, which is the land of Potawatomi and Kickapoo First people. And so in thinking about who came before me in the land and space and water around me as well. So I will ask you to, as you read that land acknowledgement, to take some time and think about the people who came before you and where you're joining from as well. If you're new to LeaderShape, if this is your first introduction to a LeaderShape program, I wanted to offer LeaderShape's vision and mission here for you, just in thinking about how we're working to create a just, caring, and thriving world where all lead with integrity and a healthy disregard for the impossible. Thank you for joining us in that space of folks who are helping to meet that mission statement of becoming, joining us with more people who are working to create that world as well. So thank you for that. We know that there are lots of definitions of leadership out there. This is the one that LeaderShape uses. Leadership involves living in a state of possibility, making a commitment to a vision, developing relationships to move vision into action, and sustaining a high level of integrity. Effective leadership takes place in the context of a community and results in a more equitable society. As I mentioned earlier, I'm Abby Prince. I'm the Director of Program Quality and Management at LeaderShape, and I'm so glad to be able to be joined by Dr. Denny Roberts today and talking about infusing international perspectives in leadership education. Denny has been very well connected to LeaderShape for so long and has been so gracious in advocating for LeaderShape and being a part of this great work and joining a lot of these sessions over the months that we've been starting these. And we're so glad to be joined by Denny today to talk more about his perspectives and his context and expertise. And so, Denny, if you'd like to introduce yourself to the group, I'll turn things over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Abby. And it's a delight to be with you today. As Abby said, I've kind of reconnected with LeaderShape through these conversations, and it has been so fun to see people that I've known in previous iterations of my life, as well as those that are new and I've never had a chance to meet before. So I really hope that you'll feel free to contribute your ideas as we forge into this question about how to infuse international perspectives into our leadership learning. I have felt like LeaderShape was a very, very important place for people that were deadly serious about leadership. And these conversations are really the coming to fruition of that reality. You know, it's tough sometimes as leadership educators to figure out where do you turn to find people who have great ideas, who are open and curious themselves, want to explore ideas. And I just think these conversations are spectacular. this week, and I don't know if you were there or not, but I was there for John Dugan's presentation, and I enjoyed his perspective so much. I always enjoyed what he has to say in his writing, but it's also fun to see him in person. But he had some ideas about sustaining culture and being identity responsive, which that's a phrase he used several times that just really hit me very strongly. And what John was doing was relating that to domestic US diversity, equity, and inclusion, of course. Well, guess what? The application in an international setting is really pretty amazing. And I'm going to come back to that later on to explore a little bit about, well, what would that phrase mean if you did apply it to international issues. As Abby has indicated, I'm kind of a lifelong learner of leadership. I stumbled into leadership when I was at the University of Maryland as a doctoral student way back in the dark ages. And I began to be interested in the area, and I've never given it up. I've had a variety of kinds of roles throughout my career, and even now post-career, now that I'm not officially working full-time anymore, I still write with colleagues, I still present with colleagues, I interact, I coach, I do whatever I can to support people that are on this journey of understanding leadership, because it's complicated, much more complicated than, frankly, sometimes we recognize. And I've learned that particularly in my own community here. I live in Wilmette, Illinois, which is a North Shore suburb of Chicago. And there's a lot of stereotypes out there about Wilmette, but what is interesting about Wilmette is Wilmette's actually a relatively diverse community, socioeconomically and culturally. And I moved into a section of Wilmette where there had been a long neglect of stormwater management in the community. So the first day we showed up in our house in 2012, our mail person informed us that our house flooded on a regular basis. And it was kind of like, what? Wow, that was this stunning revelation. And so we started working to resolve the problem. Well, I found out from talking to neighbors that this had been a perennial problem for decades that the village had ignored. So I kind of started an effort which was grassroots oriented to get neighbors involved in the conversation. And guess what? We had an over $300 million project to improve stormwater management, and especially in this day of climate change. I'm telling you, when storms hit that give you 4 inches of rain in an hour, you need a major stormwater management system. And we got it done. We got it done because people listened to each other, and because we tried some new approaches to leadership, which ultimately worked out. So I use that as an example to basically say, I hope you're a lifelong student of leadership also, and always eager to learn and to discover new things, because I discover new things every day. The inspiration for today's conversation is really based on two written documents that I've written relatively recently. And Abby has put those on the screen for us. I worked with actually another Roberts, who happens to be Darby Lee Roberts, and my daughter. She and I co-edited a New Directions for Student Leadership book called Enhancing Students' Capacity for International Leadership in 2018. We had some incredible authors in that book, and I frequently look back at it for inspiration, and I did for today. And then a more recent piece of work that I've done is with a really wonderful new colleague to me, Aoi Yamanaka, who is at George Mason University, a new scholar. And what we were asked to do by Susan Komovez and Julia Owen was to contribute a chapter to a book on leadership research. And they asked Aoi, who is from Japan culturally, but is now in the US, and me to basically explore this topic. And so we did a lot of research on culture and cultural understanding within leadership, and trying to help by contributing a chapter to where are we really in this whole evolution of our understanding of international implications for leadership. So these two things really came from kind of the gnawing realization of what I didn't know. And that's something that actually has been the inspiration for most of my writing and my entire life. Every time I didn't know something, then I dug into it, and sure enough, it almost always ended up in some kind of a publication, which is really kind of a fun way to live, to try to chart your learning through your contributions through literature. So that's an admonition to those of you that are on here. Write so that your voice is there for the record. Well, I have an opening question that I'd like to ask you. And if you wouldn't mind, hop into the chat and I'll give you a couple of minutes to think. But what does it mean to you to adopt an international perspective? What is that? How does that relate to what you're doing right now? And what would it mean for you to adopt that view?
Nice to see these responses coming in slowly in the chat, I think, because I think I'm not alone in thinking about, like, this seems like an easy question to answer until you start writing your responses to it, and then think, this is a broad response, really, and thinking about what does that perspective look like for us, and how are we incorporating that in lots of areas of our lives too. I think that reflection of our domestic view, then reflecting on that and being aware of that. I see some responses here around centering the way we approach the world, thinking about beyond our international, our individual and social perspective. Thanks for that, Evan. Cultural approaches to leadership in our programs. Thanks, Melissa.
I love the one comment about taking others' perspectives, other international perspectives to enhance our own understanding.
Yeah.
So incorporating other people's ideas is really helpful too.
Yeah.
Decentering Western perspectives for certain.
Good. Mm-hmm.
Well, these are very, very on target perspectives from my point of view. And my point in even asking the question was that there's kind of I think a marginalization of international perspectives, that a lot of times people think of themselves as operating solely in a domestic environment. So you try to address the domestic issues and questions that we have without really recognizing that that is set in this broader international context. And internationalization is in education, it's in business, it's in politics, it's in social justice, it's in identity, it's literally in all of those kinds of places. And I think understanding the pervasiveness of it is what is very, very important. Which leads me to a poll, and you've kind of anticipated some options here. Just give us an idea here of what do you think is required in order for you to be prepared to engage internationally? What of these items might you see as being important? Wow, isn't that fun?
It's nice being behind the scenes and watching the responses come in, isn't it, Denny?
It is definitely, yeah. Yeah.
Give folks a couple more seconds to respond, to get closer to 100% of those people. Okay. We're at 79% response. Is that good enough to end the poll? 82% now?
Sure, that's great.
All right.
Yeah.
We'll go ahead and end things here, and I'll share those results with you all.
And that's incredible, because that's what I had hoped. I hope that you would just automatically see all of the above. And really, when you think about all of those phrases, aware of your own culture, kind of digging down and deep into yourself, being curious, exploring others, understanding that we'll probably never know enough. Ambiguity is always there, and being able to adapt and respond to different environments, and then being courageous, just being willing to do it. All of those things are so important to us as we try to adopt a more international perspective. Well, let's go another direction on another chat question then. What is the difference, in your estimation, between an internationalization perspective versus a globalization perspective? What is the difference? Just offer some input on the chat if you would.
Denny, I shared with you before everyone joined us that I struggled with the answer to this question. So I will appreciate polling the audience for their responses here. And then your insights as well. Maybe we're all waiting for your insights, Denny.
But yeah, I think people are afraid to
sure.
put it out there. Yeah. Yeah. International positive difference. Yeah. Globalization being shared qualities. Yeah.
I like that differentiation. That's really good. Cultural perspectives into consideration with internationalization. I'm seeing a lot of that in the responses here.
Well, the reason that I raised this question is that if you read in the internationalization literature, actually a lot of authors don't differentiate the terms. They use them back and forth. And I think they use it back and forth because they feel like, to repeat the same word over and over and over is not appropriate. But the fact of it is the words are different. And they do have different ultimate purposes. And, those of you that have commented in the chat are right on target here. Really, when you look at, and I'm relying here on an author that I particularly enjoy reading. Her name is Jane Knight. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she writes heavily in the international higher education literature. And she differentiates the terms very clearly and basically says that rather than using them synonymously, we need to differentiate so we understand the purposes and the potential outcomes of either. And internationalization generally strives to retain and honor difference, and it accepts that there are different ways of approaching the world. There are different values, there are different customs, and that those are legitimate. Globalization is more often used in terms of economic or political terms, and it often includes the imposition of a perspective that is very power-oriented. So if you think of globalization, you think of domination of products, so McDonald's or Nike, or you even think of Western powers. So you think of the United States as a dominant political player in terms of globalization. And unfortunately, in that example, globalization most often, whether it's intentional or unintentional, doesn't really matter. But the bottom line is that it discredits the difference and it doesn't learn from the difference. So I think that these terms are really very, very different. And I think that we would be better off if we were more careful about our language. And if people ask us, well, what do you mean? Then let's have an answer, so that we can differentiate it, and particularly to focus on the different outcome that you might expect if you embrace internationalization versus embracing globalization. Well, then that leads us to the next poll question. So would you respond by letting us know, how would you rank yourself? And I believe this is one that is not, you can do multiple responses. You have to peg yourself. So where do you think you are on the continuum of being prepared for the international dynamics of leadership.
It's a good thing we're all here as lifelong learners.
Yep.
So I will end that poll and share the results with everyone here.
And this was precisely the point. And I was hoping this would be the result, because you are demonstrating your curiosity. We have a couple of people that feel pretty aware. My guess is that they study this. This is their work, so they would, of course, rank themselves being more highly or basically aware. But there's a lot of us that see ourselves as slightly aware or negligibly aware. I can't say that one. And what is so critical about this is that we're all on a journey here in terms of understanding this emerging world that is, in fact, international around us. And to think that we are kind of the masters of the subject and we've got it all down pat is probably going to undermine the ability to learn more. It shuts off humility. It shuts off the curiosity that allows us to be constant learners. One of the authors that I ran into when we were looking at the leadership research across culture was an author by the name of Zander. And her book in 2020 identified some really, really interesting perspectives that she summarized them in the following elements. She said that basically, in order to grow or develop in our international perspectives requires a degree of experiential rigor, a depth of engagement, cultural distance, so being distant or unique from the culture where you are attempting to adapt, and then constructive feedback from multiple sources in that learning process. I can't tell you how much her research relates to my own life experience. I traveled for the first time in 2005. It was the first time I had ever been outside of the United States, had a passport or anything. And prior to that, just completely US centric in terms of my views. Well, I worked and studied a bit in Europe in 2005, and then that led to basically taking the big risk, which was to work abroad permanently in Qatar for 7 years, from 2007 to 2014. And what I found in myself was basically this just kind of emerging centering in my learning. I learned that, in fact, practically every encounter I had, I needed to understand the cultural lens that was impacting the way I was interacting with this person. So how were they listening to me? How was I listening to them? What cultural perspectives might we be using to filter our reactions to each other? All of those things began to be so just kind of ubiquitous in my experience that even today, I mean, my reaction in most settings where I see new people, meet new people, even when it comes to like riding the L here in Chicago, I'm one of those goofy types that will strike up a conversation with somebody that's riding in the subway, and especially if they look a little different than me, I'm even more inclined to reach out and to at least greet them and express some kind of hospitality towards them. And this is really the whole idea of, as we encounter more difference and as we have more success in it and are fed by it and learn through it, then it becomes almost an insatiable sort of thing. We constantly want to do that. And I see this in so many of my colleagues, one of whom is on our conversation today. Evan Witt was with me in Qatar, and I know he and other colleagues that were over there in Qatar just traveled incessantly. So every time there was a chance to get out of Qatar to travel, because you're centrally located in the Middle East, you can get to Asia, to Europe, to Africa, you can go to so many different places. And so you see this kind of insatiable appetite to get out there and to learn from being exposed to various different places around the world. So I've kind of exposed the next polling question here. So the next question is, how can internationalization be incorporated into learning about leadership? So if you were to think about the key ways that you might be able to begin to then do something about integrating an international perspective, what might that include?
I will say too, I know the Zoom chat feature does not allow a response to other. So if you responded to other and you want to share in the chat what that looks like for you and thinking about incorporating internationalization, please share with us there. I see in the chat, Evan is continuing his world travels by heading off to the World Cup soon.
And I'm so jealous that Evan is able to do that. It's just driving me crazy, but it's not a trip I can make this fall. So.
All right. Well, we've got 76% of people responded here. So I'll go ahead, 80% now. So I'll go ahead and end that poll and share the results with you all.
And obviously, we've got a lot of options here. And this really relates to the breadth of opportunity that we have. There are so many different ways that we can incorporate an international perspective. And what's so important about that is that it needs, in my estimation, this is a value judgment I know coming from me, but the international lens needs to constantly be there. So it needs to be operating when we are tapping into examples. I know as a LeaderShape facilitator, when I used to do that, when I first started with LeaderShape, I did the best I could, but I wasn't very well educated. And so most of my examples were US centric historically and in personalities. Occasionally, people would note Mahatma Gandhi or some other international figure, but most often the examples used, the people that were highlighted were those from US cultures. Further than just having the examples, also doing a critical examination of the perspectives of what we think of as leadership. And one of the key issues that is just a very brief comment that there's a lot of research on is the difference between me and we. That in many Western cultures, I and me and mine are very often used. And that's really the intellectual framework that we come into when we think about leadership. And even when we talk about group leadership, frequently we're still focusing on an individual's role even within that group. Whereas in cultures that are more based out of Asia, where you have Confucian thinking or where you have different religious perspectives, Islam being one, that basically embraces and includes more, you get a very different view about what leadership would be. And so examining those cultural lenses and how they affect how we're portraying leadership is very important. Enacting different approaches. Also, I think of the first time that I led a LeaderShape session in Qatar when we had participants in the program that were female that were covered. And I was new to Doha and to Qatar, and I didn't know quite what to do with that in terms of whether that meant that it was okay for me to engage or whether I should avoid, what should I do? Well, you know what? Those that were covered in that culture were wanting to be engaged in the very same way that other students. There surely was something that I needed to get used to, which was covering, and to accommodate that within my own understanding about what people expect. But that was a different way of me enacting my leadership, which was to understand that even when things look different, sometimes they aren't that different. So it's recognizing the difference, but then also recognizing the sameness that's involved there. Well, then how do you learn about leadership? What are the ways that you think are most useful to you as you are on this journey? And most of us here are saying that we have quite a bit to learn. And even for those of you that are pretty sophisticated in your knowledge, where do you turn to learn? How do you find out about international implications of leadership?
I love this question, Denny, and I love the response options that we have here as well. I think that travel seems the most obvious, perhaps, but I like that you've given us these other options to consider as well, when that maybe isn't an option for us to do as much as we would like. I think financially or just having time away to do that is hard sometimes, but you've given us a lot to think about in other ways that we can do that. And again, because Zoom doesn't allow us to provide a chat box for other. If you responded to other and you want to share with us in the chat what that other is for you, if you'd like to share with us, please do so, because I think as learners here, we're all looking for more ways to do that. But Denny, you can tell us the right answer here. I'll end the poll and share the results with you all here.
Right. Well, what I do find interesting in this one is that, there's endorsement of reading and interaction and experience that are all more embraced than travel, even though travel is a very important one. Mm-hmm. And I think part of the problem here is that it's kind of assumed, especially when you look at the way that students experience or faculty experience in international travel is configured. I mean, we usually think of that as a very privileged thing to do. When I was an undergraduate at Colorado State University, one of my bucket list items as an undergraduate student was traveling to another country. I actually was a music major. I played piano and sang, and my dream was to go to Salzburg, Austria, and study at the Mozarteum. And so when people would say, "What do you want to do?" that's what I would say. Well, mm-hmm. I didn't have a ghost of a chance of going to Salzburg, Austria, and studying at the Mozarteum. There wasn't any way that I could financially afford to do that. And unfortunately, travel is expensive. There are ways to make travel less expensive. You don't always have to go on first class flights or stay in great and luxurious hotels. You can travel in very different sorts of ways. But travel, by and large, is seen as a very privileged activity. And one of the things I'm kind of fascinated by in terms of watching some of the comments that I see on Facebook, for instance, is people like to post, where they've been and where they're traveling and that kind of thing. And I've been more reluctant to do that lately, basically because I'm actually more interested in sharing what I've learned from traveling or hearing what others have learned from their travel than that they have traveled. And I think it's perhaps a fine detail, but it takes a little bit of the edge of privilege off of our social media presence when we start talking about what did I learn from visiting another country or being in another culture, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But all of these things are obviously very, very important. And I'm actually most delighted that 96% of you saw interaction as being critical. You may or may not be aware, but international students in the United States actually leave their study experience when they are here in the US pretty disappointed that they've not had much of an opportunity to interact with Americans. And that goes for faculty and staff, it goes for students, it goes for community. By and large, one of the highest priority items for international students studying in the US is to learn about American culture. That's what they want. They want the American brand of education, but they also want to understand us. And they go home disappointed because we didn't engage. Mm-hmm. And it's so awesome that 95% of you say that's a primary way to learn. And, that's back to the, talking to people that look different than me on the subway. I mean, you can do this any place. And what we really need to do is we need to work with our students to help them understand the importance of engaging in respectful sorts of ways across culture.
Denny, I see some comments in the chat here too. I like Amrutha's suggestion around watching international movies or watching movies about other cultures. I think that's really great. And then Andrea suggesting that you have an international guide or a local guide to show you that city, and not just here are the things Americans like to do when they're in our new place. Denny, I think you would appreciate, I was just co-leading a session recently where we had a lot of international participants. And there was one particular student from Venezuela who became best pals with another American student during the session. And I have no doubt that they will be lifelong buds as they leave that session and go back to their campus. And it was just so wonderful to see that interaction among those students and the ways in which they were interacting and learning about each other.
And in the world we live in, where social media is readily available, those relationships can be maintained and they can develop over time. I actually have, the one comment from Andrea about travel can sometimes be very surface oriented unless you engage it by having, a local guide to help you. Well, I had a person who I knew from my Qatar days, and he left and went back to his home in India. And we had a great relationship when he was in Qatar. So my wife and I traveled to India, and Shah took us all over the western region of India, Kerala. And we traveled up into the mountains, we went to the beaches, we went to historical sites. And what was fascinating is that I now realize that I actually violated some cultural rules when we were traveling that probably put Shah and the other person who was serving as our driver at a difficult point. But you know what? I talk to Shah at least every other 2 or 3 weeks today. So we get on Skype and we talk about how his experience is. And I know his life. He went back to India and now he lives in Oman. And we talk about his experience, and he likes to practice English with me, and I like to practice Arabic with him, and we learn from each other in our cultures. So this idea of getting beyond the surface, no matter whether it's in our interactions, our experience, our travel, our reading, all of those are wonderful opportunities. And there are some really terrific films that are out there that really are beginning to kind of break the mold. I think it is important on some of those films to be very careful that some of the stereotypes are not perpetuated, because there certainly are people that are writing and are producing that sometimes have not really done the deep work. So, engaging with others, really digging in and trying to figure out what do those films or those books mean is very, very critical. Well, I want to transition a little bit to kind of talk at you for a moment. And the reason I want to do that is that our research on cross-cultural leading is really, I think, at kind of an early stage, even though there are some researchers that are very prominent and are seen all over the place. And many of you that are particularly familiar with leadership studies probably know of the GLOBE project. And the GLOBE study was basically a way of analyzing the difference across culture that one might expect if you were attempting to lead in that culture. And what's fascinating is that there was kind of this rush of enthusiasm about the GLOBE model from the very beginning. But as I dug more deeply into it, there have been a lot more reservations raised about it. And in fact, there are those who believe that the GLOBE study, as well as other studies, have really done little more than perpetuate sophisticated stereotypes, okay? And those sophisticated stereotypes basically come from people believing that somehow the GLOBE study or whatever study of culture kind of has the truth about any cultural setting. And the fact of it is, all of our learning is provisional. It's always changing, and it should be. And that is the issue with leadership research, is that particularly as we do our own research, or as we apply that research in practice when we are teaching leadership or we're cultivating leadership in those around us, is to make sure that we're not perpetuating sophisticated stereotypes, that we in fact are digging deeper. And here I want to go back to John Dugan's comment about domestic diversity. And there's practically no cultural model that truly advocates embracing and sustaining culture. And that's what John was basically saying, is that in terms of identity in leadership learning, what your goal really ought to be is to embrace and to sustain, to find ways to continue to nurture the culture that each individual has, particularly in US institutions. And I don't know how this rings with you. I hope it does not offend you if you're particularly involved in working with international students. But so many of our institutions in higher education today are bolstering their budgets with full pay international students. And they're desperate to maintain them because they know that the domestic enrollment is declining. And so one of the easiest ways to fill that gap is to recruit full pay international students. And unfortunately, precious little in some institutions is done to actually embrace culture and to help visiting international students sustain their own culture. Yes, they want to know about the United States, but they also are strong, they are resilient, they have their own strengths. And in the same way that we used to view minority students in a deficit model, there's a lot of literature that looks at Latinx students or African-American students as if there was something wrong with them. That's why they weren't being maintained in higher education. That's why they weren't successful at the same rates. Well, folks, now we're flipping that. We're saying, well, what's wrong with our environments? What wasn't working about the educational environment that Latinx students, Asian American students, African American students, international students, what is it about our institutions that is causing those students not to be as successful as they should be? So I think it's really important to those of you that are aware of the diversity, equity, and inclusion literature. There's a lot of corollary there. And Donna Lee was the contributing author in the book that we put out in 2018 that specifically talks about why sometimes DEI advocates and international programs don't mix, and that they see themselves as on somehow a different wavelength. The fact of it is, there's a lot of commonality. Yes, there are differences, but there's a lot of commonality that they can both benefit from. So what I'm saying here is use the models that are available, be constructively critical in terms of your thinking about them, use your own experience, explore new experiences to basically drive your learning more deeply, and then approach this always through some provisionality. Understand that you're on a journey and working. And particularly finding people that can help you in terms of helping you navigate cultural difference. I've just found so much benefit in colleagues that I've learned through and from in terms of my own shortcomings, in terms of my cultural understandings. And that goes for domestic questions, it goes for international questions as well. And sometimes cultural informants need to get really, really clear messages from us in order to be able to engage. Because if you're white, cisgendered, privileged like I am, automatically there will be suspicion. There should be, in terms of what is he up to? And so the invitation to be a cultural informant needs to be very sincere, very authentic, so that in fact, you can bridge that gap and you can actually learn from others. And our time is getting to be, we've got about 10 minutes, which is awesome. That's great. I wonder what other kinds of questions or concerns are out there for you. And if you do want to turn on the mic, I think that that's okay from my point of view. Abby, is that all right? Or post them in the chat too. But I'd particularly like to know, where are you getting your knowledge? How are you learning? What are the problems that you see in terms of trying to create an environment where international perspectives are in fact included in our leadership learning for all students? Where are you getting your strength? Where are you getting your ideas? Be courageous.
I will stop sharing during this time if that's okay with you, just so that we can see
Sure,
each other in the sharing of ideas. Okay.
Please do.
Yeah. A lot of great thinkers in this room.
You know, I just saw Willow's comment, and I had not seen that before. Willow, are you still on board with us? Yes, you are. Unmute, Willow, and tell us a little bit more about a key piece is often overlooked in the element of choice. What do you mean by that, Willow?
Sure. I hope you can hear me. I'm having trouble getting my, there we go, videos live. Yeah, so there, you know, I shared that comment with my experience doing leadership trainings for adults in an international context, and the seminar series I was running was Leading in an Era of Globalization, and a major theme is capitalism, because so much of leadership and why people want to understand how to be good leaders relates to success playing the capitalist game, and the attributes of folks who tend to surface at the top in our economic structures. And so when I said choice, there's a piece we would use called I think it's called the Golden Straitjacket, about capitalism, and and it's spread around the world, and so much to be said about that. I'll stop here, but that's just a little bit of background behind those comments that I shared.
Yeah, if it's easy for you to do this, please post in the chat what did you say, the straitjacket of?
Sure. Let me poke around and
I mean, it sounds like an awesome article. I'd love to get a hold of it. It sounds really interesting. And I mean, what's really amazing, and when we were in Qatar, we hosted a lot of study tours. They were generally educational study tours, but sometimes they were, business or political or social justice folks. And what was absolutely fascinating was, particularly among European and American groups, there was almost always this immediate rush to judgment. And in Qatar, the rush to judgment was most often assuming that women didn't have any power and that women were subjugated and were always marginalized. And I can tell you that's not true. There's a lot of powerful women. They may be powerful in different ways than many Westerners expect, but there are powerful women. And the key is go to that strength, go to that resilience, rather than to think of it as a deficit. And particularly, the reason that I think Westerners tend to judge is that we often have that capitalist orientation, which brings power through money. And that power, when you've got the power differential, is very, very debilitating in terms of learning, because the assumption is all that, that I've got the right way and I've come to save you. And that was something that we would frequently get from people that would visit us. They would come and they would think that their role was to be some sort of a savior for the culture, to make them aware of Western ideals and Western values. And it was fascinating to see that happen time and time again. I'm reading Bethany's nice offering here. I'm trying to read this quickly. Bethany, do you want to just hop on and offer that to us verbally too?
Sure. Basically, in listening to lots of things that you had to say, I was sort of reassessing a mentor program that I had done this past semester for the first time with our international office, and just kind of realizing the truth in what you were saying about students leaving this country unfulfilled because they didn't get the connection with our American students that they were hoping for. And realizing too that perhaps our American students weren't putting value in connecting with them. You know, a lot of our ideas stem, I guess, from what you just said, actually. American people or students thinking, you know, I'm your savior. This is what I'm doing is right, or what I'm doing is more important, or whatever. And I think we need to create a way where we can take our students out of those ideas and help them see value in sharing their culture just for the sake of sharing it, and also learning from others just for the sake of learning and sharing,
right,
you know, other cultures.
Beautifully stated, Bethany. And you know, that's the flip side here. That if domestic students in the U.S. don't engage, you know, obviously international students are not getting what they want, but our domestic students are not learning what they need to learn. And it's learning to value different cultural contexts. And, you know, most of our students are going to have some sort of work experience in their lifetimes that is going to take them to a place that's going to have a lot of international implications, whether that's political, economic, social, or whatever it is. And the more that we can do to prepare them for that, the better off they'll be. And we're really doing them a disservice if we don't convince them that there is much to be learned from people of other cultures, and that starts with respect and curiosity, you know, and humility. You know, that's where we have to start the whole journey. And you know, I get sometimes a little impatient with that, which I need to dial it down a bit when when I do that. I'm sorry, but you know, but I just want people to understand, and to understand how fun, frankly, intercultural learning is. Some of the best experiences I've had were when I was traveling internationally and I was totally out of control. Didn't know the language, didn't know the culture, had no idea where I was on the map. I didn't know anything. And I was totally dependent on the people around me. And what an empowering and uplifting experience to know that I can turn to people around me and I can rely on others. You can't always, I understand that, not to be naive. But by and large, when you travel, when you engage with other people, when you try to learn from other people, there's an awful lot of goodwill out there, an awful lot of goodwill. Yeah. And I think you're calling for that, which is awesome, Bethany. Thank you.
I see a comment right above on Bethany's too. Takeda, am I saying that right? The suggestion around programming and events around world languages too, which kind of lends itself to what you've just shared too. I think just in learning about other cultures through their language, perhaps. And I'm sure with international students on campuses being able to share about their languages, or for us just learning other languages as well. Is it Takeda? I don't know if I'm extrapolating too much from your recommendation here, but if you have others that you'd like to share with us, that's great.
Sure, thanks. Simply where I'm going with this is that it's summer, so we're trying to prepare programming for students before they come onto campus. And we are having more conversation. I think this leadership, the conversations have been very important for us to think critically and be more direct in how we're going about being more inclusive in our programming, whether that is in terms of gender matters, whether that's racial, whether that is international even. But I think where, we've got faculty come from different parts of the world, and they've reached out and said, hey, how can I, especially in world languages, they teach different languages, but how can we use that together, combined? For example, one of the things we'd like to do is we did an event some years ago where we took students that were international and US to a restaurant in Lexington, Kentucky. And the gentleman who owned the restaurant, he was an immigrant, and he talked about how he found himself in the US and started a business from the ground up. And I think you combine several different elements in terms of entrepreneurship, culturally, those kind of things. And so it's not just a matter of going together to have a meal and have that fellowship, but I think more so to say, what can a student who is from the United States learn from that? That I think we've got the same goals, right? If you're an entrepreneur, right, whether you're here or in Morocco, you have the same aspirations, but look at how someone who comes not from this land, look at how he did it. So I think it's twofold in those ways, perhaps, but that was just kind of the thought pattern I was coming to.
Yes. Thank you for that. I really appreciate that. I know we are bumping up against the end of our hour here, and I know we're about to lose a lot of you. So I just want to quickly share in the chat a couple of things. One, there's a link to register for tomorrow's session, which is around helping people thrive with remote work. I also want to send a gigantic thank you to Denny for sharing with us about your expertise and your knowledge area that you care so much about with this international leadership. Denny, I did not know that you had not traveled internationally until the early 2000s. That's fascinating. I think of you as such an expert international mind. And so knowing that you've gained this knowledge in a short amount of time, I think that it's critical how you have shared that knowledge with all of us here today. Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope that you're able to join us again for the session tomorrow, and hopefully we'll do more of these sessions once the academic year starts back up again in August. But Denny, thank you so much for your time and knowledge sharing here with us today.
Thank you, Abby, and thank you, everyone. It's really been a pleasure. And please correspond with me if you would like. dcroberts48@gmail is my address, and I'd be more than happy to correspond. And I have 2 blogs that I maintain on internationalization and one on leadership. So please join me. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I've shared your email address in the chat feature there too. So folks want to jot that down.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.